Cool, and this is just a visual representation of body fat ranges. In reality, like, it's difficult to get an accurate representation of someone's body fat. There's such a large variance between people. People store body fat in different areas. It's really hard to give a blanket like this is. You need to look like that picture over to the far left if you're going to be ready for a show. It's so hard to actually get a good idea with our measuring tools currently. This is just a good idea. If you're someone, you can kind of give a loose comparison here. Really what matters is we want to be roughly between 10 and 20% if we're mass gaining for males, and we want to start on the lower end of that so we have lots of room to grow. And for females, we want to be about 20 to 30. I think it's like 18 to 28% because they tend to carry more just natural essential body fat levels. Move on to the next one. Cool, so why would we work within these ranges? So if we're too lean, we're like, 10% or lower, we're getting ready for a show, we're coming out of a show, we're in a situation where we're not primed for muscle growth. Basically, you get compromised sex hormone function. So if you're a natural athlete, you're not going to have any, your sex hormones are going to decline. Estrogen, testosterone, progesterone for women as well. You have higher stress hormones and less muscle growth comes out of that. And for women, they get loss of menstruation as well. It's a pretty good idea of if you're too lean to be able to mass gain is that you don't have menstruation. And for women, for both populations, too fat, you'll experience compromised sex hormone functioning, declining health as well. So you get things like higher blood pressure, you get higher fasting glucose, elevated LDL, just lots of things that may get in the way of just general health. And then potential for loose skin as well when you get a little bit too much above those ranges. So one thing I mentioned down here is the P ratio. If you're not familiar, it's referred to as the partitioning ratio. It's the amount of muscle growth to body fat ratio that you're putting on. Probably not the best way to describe that, but in reality, this doesn't really become a concern. It basically becomes a concern after this. So you would really be more worried about your health before you'd be worried about P ratio. Like if you're in a higher body fat range, what happens is you start to get like high blood glucose. You start to get higher inflammation, which may blunt muscle growth, but that doesn't happen until those higher ranges anyway. So if you stay between the 10 and 20 or the 20 to 30, you're pretty much safe and you don't have to worry about muscle growth. If you stay within those ranges, you're putting on the most muscle you can while minimizing fat gain for the most part, based on your genetics. Cool, so muscle gain duration. As you can see, we have a skeleton here. He is waiting to grow muscle. It's a really long process. Even for enhanced athletes, it takes time. So as far as muscle growth, to be able to detect that you're even growing muscle, you need to be in a surplus for at least 4 weeks. You can't be like, I'm going to do a bulk this week, and then next week I'm going to do a cut, and then next week. You basically need to even be able to detect that you're supplying enough nutrition even on the scale. You need to be at least collecting data for 4 weeks, right? If you were to, there's other processes that need to take place as well. But if you were to even detect like a small gain, you say you're trying to gain like 0.25% of your body weight a week, you may not be able to detect that for even a month, right? It sometimes won't come up. There's water weight fluctuations. There's lots of things that may interfere. So there is a detection problem with not being in a surplus for long enough. Muscle protein synthesis is another argument against not doing it for at least 4 weeks. Basically, muscle protein synthesis is triggered after one bout of exercise. Remember, as I said earlier, muscle protein synthesis, one of our big indicators for muscle growth. Muscle size changes are not observed for several weeks usually. So a lot of what happens in the accumulation of muscle protein takes a couple of months. So a lot of what happens when you first are exposed to a weight, you're first exposed to resistance training, it's a lot of neural adaptation. Your central nervous system is getting used to handling the load. So you'll notice sometimes you do a lift, and then next week you can, say the first time you do it, next week you can do 10 to 15 more pounds, right? Well, that's a lot of neural adaptation. That's not actual muscle growth. There's something called preparatory muscle growth, and this process takes time. It takes a lot of time. We don't have a lot of data on it, but it seems like the session you're doing today may be causing muscle growth in a couple of months, really. So it takes a lot of time. I was actually just talking with Brandon before this seminar, and he was saying how I got bigger after my show. And a lot of that was probably the training I was doing during my contest prep, but I didn't have adequate nutrition to be able to supply the muscle growth. So what happened is I had this kind of like, I gave myself enough nutrition after the show, and I had some of this rebound effect where a lot of that training I had been doing throughout the whole contest prep was kind of getting actualized after the contest prep. And then at about 6 months, so at the end of a muscle growth phase, you may see diminishing returns in regards to your response to training. So you may need really high training volumes. You may basically, like if you go into the gym and you need to get a pump, you'll notice that it takes like way more sets to get a pump, way more sets to get sore. That's something that you basically just become resistant to volume and to some of the muscle growth pathways. You also see body fat accumulation, right? There's only so many mini cuts you can do. There's only so much you can do to continue to push through. Eventually you start getting to those upper ranges of the body fat range. And then at that point, you'll need a resensitization phase, which is just a phase of lower training volume in order to reset those, for lack of a better term, reset some of those anabolic pathways and get ready for another muscle growth phase. And you may want to do like a cut as well to get some of the accumulated body fat off. And I will mention this later, but I'll mention it now as well. A lot of people are worried about gaining too much fat. Really, if you did a whole 6-month muscle growth phase, you can get most of that fat off in like 10 weeks. And in reality too, if you're doing more frequent mini cuts, you could do a couple mesocycles, a couple mesocycles of training, and you could do a mini cut and get most of the fat off you gained in 10 weeks, often a couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks even. So it's not something to be too concerned about. You do an aggressive cut, boom, you're back to where you were before your muscle growth phase. All right, you can go to the next one. So we need some objective data to be able to determine if you're in a surplus. The first being the scale. This has got a love-hate relationship with a lot of people, but it really does give us it's not like the most like, oh, we can determine, you know, how much muscle you're growing, but it just tells us that we're in a caloric surplus. We're eating enough calories to grow, right? If our body weight is going up over time, then hey, we are eating enough calories to hopefully trigger muscle growth. Basically, we use it to detect if we're in a reliable surplus. We must track body weight. I say averages because there's fluctuations day to day. So you have things like stress, electrolytes, glycogen, so muscle carbohydrate storage, fluid intake, and then a menstrual cycle for women as well. So I get clients sometimes that get upset. They weigh in a certain day and their weight is higher or lower. Say they went and had Chinese food the night before and their weight's up 5 pounds. It's not likely that they were in a surplus enough to gain 5 pounds of fat in one meal. A lot of the time, maybe they were drinking a lot of fluid, they were eating a lot of sodium. It could just be a temporary fluctuation due to different nutrition. So what we do is we collect the averages and we average it out across the week, and that accounts for a lot of these fluctuations. So when anybody's ever stressing, I say, hey, just look at your average number. That's a better representation of what's actually going on. And then basically we'll compare our averages week to week to assess trends. So I actually have built a spreadsheet that essentially takes your average from each week and it subtracts the current week from the previous week, and then it tells us how much weight you gained on average, right? And that's the best way to do it, is just to be able to compare the actual averages week to week. And then we want to make these measurements consistent as a scientist would in the lab, right? We want consistent data. So we need to be fasted most of the time because if you have food, you can have varying amounts of food. You want to weigh yourself after a bowel movement, if you can, if you're going in the morning. Same articles of clothing or no clothes. And then also, let's see what I put here. Same spot on the floor because the calibration of the scale can be off. And then also same time of day. And then do your best to not stress about individual weigh-ins, as I mentioned. And it really helps to see the data if you can. It's really simple to create in a spreadsheet, and I can always share my weight average spreadsheet with you guys too, but it's really simple. You literally just put in the date, and then you just do the average formula, and you can just average out all your weights week to week, and then just compare them. And it really can alleviate a lot of stress about weight gain. All right. Cool, so nutrition tracking. So I used to give meal plans out a lot, and I just found that across populations, even with competitive athletes, the adherence wasn't the greatest. I think a big part of it, and this is what the research shows, is that what happens is these meal plans, basically they are like, hey, I need to follow this thing, I need to eat these meals at these times. They create a rigid and dichotomous mindset around dieting and food selection. So it's a black and white choice. I eat this food or I'm off my plan, right? I eat this food or I've failed. What happens when you have to go out to dinner with your family or do something normal in your life, especially in a mass gain phase, right? You feel like you're off your plan. A lot of time people will not be able to know how to navigate a menu and choose healthier choices and stay on their plan. So they'll have a cheeseburger, right? And then what happens is the fuck it effect. what some people refer to it as, is essentially is like, oh, I already messed up on my plan. I'm not on my meal plan anymore. Let me just go off the diet completely, right? So if we do nutritional tracking, we can actually just account for this and just track the foods on our phone, or we can estimate them as well in a mass gaining phase. Doesn't have to be super accurate, but it does teach us a lot about what's in our food, what the protein, carbs, and fats are of given foods, and just what we're actually consuming. So I think it's a great learning tool. Maybe not a great long-term strategy for everybody, but I think most people should track for a given period of time. I've seen, and maybe this is relevant to the seminar, maybe it's not, but I've seen some people be critical of meal plans versus macros. A lot of the time, basically macronutrients are in all food, right? And they all get broken down to the same basic fundamental chemicals and nutrients in our body, right? So you consume protein, that gets broken down to amino acids, right? At the end of the day, you consume carbohydrates, that gets broken down into glucose and fructose. Fats get broken down into lipids, right? They all end up as the same thing in our body and fuel the same processes, right? So there's no real difference between certain foods. Maybe there's small differences in micronutrition, maybe there's small differences in the thermic effect of food, as I mentioned, but it doesn't really make a whole big difference. And then a lot of time, the people who tend to be critical of this also will be the same people who are having a cheeseburger and fries on their cheat day or their refeed day, or they'll have muffins, right? And that is essentially what a dieter will use when they're doing macros, especially someone who's closer to a show. They're not going to fit a lot of their carbohydrates and calories with muffins because they just aren't filling. So, sorry, that was just a tangent that I wanted to mention. As I mentioned, there are no clean or dirty foods. I like this, though, is that foods exist on a spectrum, right? They all serve a need. If you had a chart, and basically you have your, muscle building goals, and you have let's say on this side you have, what's a good term? Satisfaction and social relationships, right? Well, every meal you choose, every time you have a meal, generally speaking, you want to lay over here, right, if you're trying to grow muscle, but there are going to be times where you need to make these types of choices. But also you can actually, move the dial a little bit if you know how to navigate a menu at the Cheesecake Factory, right? So it doesn't have to be all one, all or the other, right? We can have balance and still progress towards our goals. Really, if you're 90% adherent with mostly clean food, even 80%, you're going to be okay. Tracking nutrition is more accurate and allows you to be more flexible. So again, if you don't know how many calories are in your chicken, rice, and broccoli meal, then how can you go to Cheesecake Factory and make a substitution? It's really difficult, and that's what causes that fuck it effect, as I mentioned. And there is an option. So this is Chronometer. I love Chronometer. It's free. It tracks your micronutrition as well, and it has verified inputs by the USDA. So it's a really great app, as opposed to MyFitnessPal, which is a collective database where everybody contributes to the database, so you can get inaccurate measurements. You don't have micronutrition, but also, it's free. It has a barcode scanner, all that good stuff. There's also AI coaching apps now. So, I know I'm telling you all this stuff, and I offer a coaching service, but there are some great AI apps out there. There's Renaissance Periodization's AI coaching app. There's Macro Factor, which will literally do all this stuff for you. For the most part, it will adjust your surplus. It'll take your weight data. It'll do all that stuff for you. So, but those are also tracking apps, and they will give you calorie macro goals, right? You can go on to the next one. Cool. And then, as I was mentioning, if it fits your macros, you really to go back on my argument earlier, I was talking about carbs, protein, fats, they all end up with the same things, right? Well, it probably isn't a smart idea to fill all of your calories with ultra processed foods, right? These are going to help you eat more calories. That's great, but they also lack micronutrition, and they can affect your health negatively if you're eating too many of them, potentially. There must be a regard for micronutrition, and as I mentioned earlier, Chronometer is a great way to reference this. They actually have, I think it's the RDA that they use to reference all of their micronutrition recommendations, so you can get a good reference of how much vitamin A, vitamin C you need, etc. So there is a place for these things. So as I mentioned earlier, we do want mostly whole foods. We want to eat a diverse selection of whole foods, lean proteins, mostly meat-based, dairy-based proteins, because they are complete proteins, right? Vegetable sources of protein tend to be incomplete. They tend to be harder to digest too, so you end up having to consume more of them to get an adequate amount of protein. We want to consume lean proteins, lots of veggies, lots of fruits, and whole grains as well if we can. I'll talk about this in a little bit because this can be a limiting factor for muscle growth. And then what happens is, once you've hit your micronutrient needs, Then you start fitting in these fun foods. Then you start fitting in these ultra palatable foods that allow you to eat more and cause you to not be limited by hunger. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's more important as you're mass gaining.